Atlas had never been afraid of a closed door, so when he refused to let Caleb touch the garage handle, Caleb knew something on the other side was waiting. Rain hammered the metal roof hard enough to drown out the wind, and the old motion light above Mrs. Harper's driveway flickered like it was fighting to stay awake. Caleb Rose stood in the narrow strip of yellow light with one hand wrapped around a rusted pry bar and the other resting against the cold garage door. Atlas pressed close to his leg, a large German shepherd with dark sable fur soaked flat against his body, his amber eyes fixed on the thin black gap beneath the door. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered. Atlas did not move. He did not bark. He only listened. 3 seconds passed. Then something shifted inside. A soft scrape crossed the concrete floor, followed by a faint tapping sound. Once, twice, 3 times. Caleb leaned closer, holding his breath. For 5 nights, his neighbor had called at exactly 2:13 in the morning with the same worried message. "Atlas is outside my garage again." Every time, Caleb had crossed the yard, apologized, and led the dog home. He had checked the fence, the latch, even the muddy ground for tracks. Nothing explained how Atlas kept getting out or why he always returned to the same place. Tonight was different. Tonight, Mrs. Harper had called with fear trembling in her voice. She said Atlas was pawing at the door, and something inside had answered. Caleb lifted the pry bar toward the lock. Atlas suddenly caught the sleeve of his jacket between his teeth and pulled him backward. Not hard, just enough. Caleb stumbled 1 step as a heavy object crashed inside the garage, striking the door with a deep metallic thud. The panels shivered beneath his palm. Atlas released him and stood between Caleb and the entrance, ears forward, body still. He had not stopped Caleb from opening the door. He had moved him out of danger. "You heard that coming," Caleb said quietly. Atlas glanced up for half a second, then returned his attention to the gap. A weak sound drifted from inside, almost too soft to recognize beneath the storm. It was not a growl. It was not the wind. It sounded like a tired breath trying to become a cry. Then came another sound, higher and smaller, followed by 2 more. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. Atlas lowered himself to the wet pavement and pushed his nose against the bottom of the door. A faint whine escaped him, unlike any sound Caleb had heard from the dog since their last deployment. It carried recognition. It carried worry. Caleb knelt beside him and placed one hand against the soaked fur along his neck. "You know what's in there, don't you?" Atlas closed his eyes for one brief moment. Then the sounds behind the door stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the thunder. Caleb looked at the lock, then at the dog beside him. Whatever waited inside had been calling for help, and Atlas had been the only one who listened. 5 nights earlier, Caleb had been asleep on the living room couch when the first call came. The digital clock beside him glowed 2:13 in the morning, painting the room in a weak blue light. Atlas was not on the rug where he usually slept. Caleb answered with a rough voice and heard Evelyn Harper apologize before telling him that his dog was sitting outside her garage. He crossed the narrow strip of lawn between their houses wearing an old marine sweatshirt, jeans, and unlaced work boots. The neighborhood was silent except for sprinklers ticking 2 streets away. Atlas sat beneath Evelyn's porch light, facing the closed garage as calmly as if he had been ordered to guard it. Caleb called him once. The German shepherd turned, walked home without resistance, and settled beside the front door. Caleb checked the backyard fence before sunrise. The gate was locked, and the board stood nearly 6 feet high. He found no loose soil, broken latch, or space wide enough for Atlas to pass through. The next day unfolded like most of Caleb's days. He opened Row Auto Repair at 7, raised the corrugated steel door, and let the familiar smells of rubber, coffee, and motor oil settle around him. Atlas rested near the office heater while Caleb replaced brake pads on a delivery van and changed the oil in a teacher's aging pickup truck. Customers knew Caleb as dependable and quiet. He gave honest estimates, returned every tool to its proper drawer, and rarely spoke about the years before he owned the shop. Atlas was different around him than he was with anyone else. The dog watched Caleb's hands, noticed changes in his breathing, and stood before Caleb realized he needed to step away from a crowded room. They had learned each other in places where attention mattered. Even after coming home, Atlas never treated silence as emptiness. He listened to it. The second call came the following night at the same minute. Evelyn sounded more puzzled than concerned. Atlas was again sitting in the exact place, his nose pointed toward the bottom of the garage door. Caleb brought him home and added a second lock to the gate. On the third night, the telephone rang at 2:13. Evelyn said Atlas had placed one ear against the concrete driveway. By the time Caleb arrived, the dog was standing over a narrow strip of mud beside the garage wall. Something pale lay between his paws. It was a short piece of weathered fabric, dark green beneath years of dirt, with faded stitching Caleb could not read in the weak porch light. He slipped it into his pocket and guided Atlas home. In the kitchen, under the bright light above the sink, Caleb washed the mud away. A familiar insignia appeared one thread at a time. His hand stopped beneath the running water. It belonged to the canine training unit where Atlas had once served alongside Sergeant Owen Hale. Caleb had not seen that symbol since the day he packed Owen's belongings into a government-issued box. Behind him, Atlas stood perfectly still. Then, from beyond the dark kitchen window, faint and distant, came 3 measured taps from Evelyn's garage. Caleb remained at the kitchen sink long after the water had turned cold, staring at the faded insignia in his palm, while the 3 taps seemed to linger inside the walls. Atlas stood near the back door, ears raised, his attention fixed beyond the glass. The dog did not pace or whine. He waited. Caleb knew that posture. Years earlier, before the repair shop and the quiet house, Atlas had used the same stillness whenever he detected something too distant for human senses. Caleb shut off the faucet and dried the strip of fabric with a dish towel. Beneath the insignia, several letters had survived the mud and time. The first 2 were clear. Owen H. Owen Hale. The name entered Caleb's mind before he could stop it. Owen had been more than a fellow Marine. He had been the kind of man who remembered birthdays, carried extra coffee, and spoke to every working dog as if it were another member of the unit. During their final assignment together, Owen had paused outside an equipment building and said he heard something behind a wall. Caleb had heard only generators and desert wind. He had told Owen they would check it after the scheduled sweep. They never did. By sunset, Owen was gone from Caleb's life, and the unanswered warning became a room Caleb kept locked inside himself. Atlas had survived that day, but something in him had changed. He began waking before alarms. He reacted to distant footsteps before anyone else noticed them. He could hear a strained breath through a closed door and sense when Caleb's sleep had turned restless. Some people called it training. Caleb knew better. Training explained obedience. It did not explain memory. The 4th night, Caleb did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the washed fabric beside him and watched the clock advance toward 2:13. Atlas lay near the door, his head resting on his paws. At 2:12, the dog opened his eyes. At 2:13, he stood. Caleb had secured both locks on the back gate and placed a heavy toolbox against it. Atlas did not approach the yard. Instead, he walked to the front door and looked back. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. He opened the door, and Atlas moved across the lawn at a steady pace, not running, not searching. He already knew where he was going. Evelyn's porch light came on as they reached the driveway. She stepped outside in a wool robe, holding a flashlight against her chest. Her silver hair was loosely tied, and worry had deepened the lines around her eyes. "I heard it tonight," she whispered. "Not the tapping. Something else." Atlas lowered his body beside the garage and pressed his ear to the concrete. Caleb knelt near him. At first, there was only the soft hiss of wind beneath the door. Then came a faint sound from somewhere inside. A small breath. A pause. Another breath, thinner than the first. Atlas placed one paw across Caleb's wrist. Caleb looked into his amber eyes and understood the command without words. This time, they would not wait until morning. Caleb rose slowly, careful not to disturb Atlas, and turned toward Evelyn. "Do you have the key?" he asked. She looked at the garage door, then at the house behind her, as though the answer were hidden somewhere in the dark windows. "Walter kept it on a brass hook in the mudroom," she said. "After he passed, I put it in a drawer. I could not bring myself to come back out here." Her voice carried no shame, only the tired honesty of someone who had been living beside a memory too large to enter. Caleb nodded. "Bring it." While Evelyn hurried inside, Atlas moved along the side wall of the garage with his nose close to the ground. Caleb followed with the flashlight. The beam passed over damp siding, a stack of flower pots, and a narrow bed of soil darkened by recent rain. Atlas stopped beneath a small window covered from the inside with brown paper. He sniffed the frame, then circled toward the rear corner. There, half buried near the foundation, was a metal tag no larger than 2 fingers. Atlas pawed gently at the mud until Caleb reached down and lifted it free. The surface was scratched and dull, but the engraved letters were still visible beneath the dirt. NOVA. Below the name was the same canine unit insignia stitched into the fabric Caleb had found the night before. For a moment, the driveway seemed to narrow around him. Nova had trained beside Atlas during their early service years. She had been quick, patient, and unusually calm around nervous recruits. Then, during a transfer between facilities, she disappeared from the records. The official report said she had been presumed lost. Owen never believed it. He had searched databases, called kennels, and kept a faded photograph of Atlas and Nova tucked inside his field notebook. Caleb looked down at Atlas. The German shepherd stared at the tag, then at the garage wall, his breathing quiet but urgent. "You remembered her," Caleb whispered. Evelyn returned with a small ring of keys trembling in her hand. Caleb showed her the tag. Her face changed. "Walter called her Nova," she said. "I thought it was just a name he chose." She explained that Walter had begun spending long hours in the garage during the final month of his life. He brought home bags of dog food, old blankets, and a portable heater. When Evelyn asked why, he told her he was helping an animal that did not trust people yet. He promised he would explain when she was ready. Then, 3 weeks earlier, Walter suffered a sudden medical emergency and never came home. Evelyn had locked the garage that same evening. She believed it was empty. Atlas pressed his shoulder against the wall and listened. From beneath the concrete came a faint scraping sound, followed by 3 soft taps. Caleb crouched and ran his hand along the foundation. Near the rear corner, a narrow ventilation opening had been covered with warped plywood. Cold air slipped through the edges, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp fur and stale food. Then something smaller whimpered from inside. Evelyn covered her mouth. Caleb stood and looked toward the darkening sky. Thick clouds were gathering above the neighborhood, and the first hard drops of rain struck the garage roof. Atlas turned toward the main door and gave one sharp bark. The storm was coming, and whatever waited inside had already been waiting too long. Caleb shifted the flashlight toward the hidden space, and the beam found Atlas lying low beside an old wooden divider. The dog's body formed a quiet shield around something curled in the shadows. Caleb moved closer, careful with every step. The air was colder there, heavy with the smell of damp blankets and stale food. Behind the divider lay a female German shepherd, thin and exhausted, her dark coat dulled by dust. A worn collar had caught beneath a metal brace, holding her close to the floor. 3 small puppies pressed against her side, their bodies rising and falling with faint, uneven breaths. Atlas touched his nose to the female's muzzle. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then her eyes opened. They were amber, clouded with fatigue, but they fixed on Atlas with unmistakable recognition. Her tail moved once against the blanket. Caleb felt the past reach into the room. "Nova," he whispered. The name seemed to settle over all of them. Atlas lowered his head beside hers, and the tension in his body softened. Caleb set the flashlight down and reached slowly toward the collar. Nova watched his hand, but did not pull away. The metal brace had twisted the strap, leaving no room for her to stand. Caleb pressed the release with his thumb, but the old buckle would not move. He took a small multi-tool from his pocket and worked carefully beneath the strap. "Easy, girl," he said. "We are getting you out." One of the puppies made a tiny sound, and Nova turned toward it despite her weakness. Atlas moved closer, warming the litter with his body. As Caleb cut through the final layer of fabric, a low mechanical murmur came from behind a stack of boxes. He swung the flashlight toward it. An old battery recorder sat on a shelf, its red light blinking faintly. A damaged speaker released 3 broken clicks, then a fragment of a man's voice. "If anyone hears this," static swallowed the next words. Evelyn crawled beneath the raised door and stopped when she saw Nova. Her face went pale. "Walter," she breathed. Caleb pressed the play button. The recording restarted in a tired but steady voice. Walter explained that he had found Nova weeks earlier near an abandoned storage lot, frightened and close to giving birth. He had recognized the service tag on her collar and brought her to the garage where she could rest. He planned to contact Caleb after earning her trust. Then his health began to fail. The message ended with a simple request. Do not let her be alone. The recorder clicked 3 times and went silent. Caleb understood then why the sound had returned at the same hour each night. The failing timer had been replaying Walter's message into the darkness, and Atlas had heard it through walls, rain, and distance. Caleb freed the collar. Nova tried to rise, but her legs trembled. He slipped one arm beneath her chest and another beneath her body, lifting her gently. Evelyn gathered the puppies into a blanket. Atlas walked beside them as they moved toward the garage door. Outside, red emergency lights appeared through the rain. Caleb looked down at Nova resting against him, then at Atlas keeping pace. Years ago, he had missed one warning and carried the silence ever since. Tonight, the warning had been heard. The emergency crew opened the garage door fully and cleared a safe path through the fallen shelves. Rain swept across the driveway in silver sheets while Caleb carried Nova toward the waiting veterinary vehicle. She felt far too light in his arms, but her breathing remained steady against his chest. Evelyn followed with the puppies wrapped together in Walter's old wool blanket. Atlas stayed so close to Nova that his shoulder brushed Caleb's knee with every step. At the clinic, warm lights spilled across polished floors, and the sharp scent of antiseptic replaced the damp cold of the storm. Dr. Marissa Cole met them at the entrance with 2 technicians and guided Nova into an examination room. Caleb placed her carefully on a padded table. Atlas tried to follow, then stopped when Caleb touched his collar. Let them help her, Caleb said. Atlas sat outside the glass door, eyes fixed on Nova as the staff checked her temperature, offered fluids, and examined the puppies one at a time. No one raised a voice. No one rushed without purpose. The room moved with the quiet precision Caleb remembered from field clinics, where calm hands could make fear loosen its grip. Evelyn lowered herself into a chair beside him, still holding Walter's blanket. Rainwater darkened the hem of her robe, and a strand of silver hair clung to her cheek. I should have opened that garage, she said. Caleb watched Atlas through the glass. You were grieving. So was she. Evelyn looked toward Nova, her expression folding inward. Caleb understood the weight behind those words. Guilt often arrived after the danger had passed, when the mind began inventing all the moments that might have changed everything. He had lived inside that habit for years. Walter left the message because he knew you would need help, Caleb said. Atlas heard it. That is what mattered tonight. Dr. Cole emerged after nearly an hour. Nova was severely dehydrated and weak, but her heart was steady. The puppies were cold and hungry, yet all 3 responded to warmth and food. They have a real chance, she said. Evelyn closed her eyes and released a breath that sounded like a prayer. Atlas stood before the doctor finished speaking. Through the glass, Nova lifted her head. Her gaze found him immediately. The door opened, and Atlas entered slowly, waiting for permission with every step. He approached the table and rested his chin near Nova's front paw. Her toes shifted until they touched the fur along his muzzle. Caleb sat on the floor beside them. He had spent years believing he needed to remain standing, even when standing was only another way of hiding. That night, with rain tapping softly against the clinic windows, he let his back rest against the wall. Atlas leaned against one shoulder. Evelyn sat on the other side, holding a sleeping puppy close to her chest. Caleb closed his eyes. For once, he did not hear Owen's unanswered warning. He heard Nova breathing. He heard the puppies stirring beneath the blanket. He heard Atlas sigh as the tension finally left his body. Somewhere between those small sounds, the locked room inside Caleb opened just enough to let the silence out. The emergency crew opened the garage door fully and cleared a safe path through the fallen shelves. Rain swept across the driveway in silver sheets while Caleb carried Nova toward the waiting veterinary vehicle. She felt far too light in his arms, but her breathing remained steady against his chest. Evelyn followed with the puppies wrapped together in Walter's old wool blanket. Atlas stayed so close to Nova that his shoulder brushed Caleb's knee with every step. At the clinic, warm lights spilled across polished floors, and the sharp scent of antiseptic replaced the damp cold of the storm. Dr. Marissa Cole met them at the entrance with 2 technicians and guided Nova into an examination room. Caleb placed her carefully on a padded table. Atlas tried to follow, then stopped when Caleb touched his collar. Let them help her, Caleb said. Atlas sat outside the glass door, eyes fixed on Nova as the staff checked her temperature, offered fluids, and examined the puppies one at a time. No one raised a voice. No one rushed without purpose. The room moved with the quiet precision Caleb remembered from field clinics, where calm hands could make fear loosen its grip. Evelyn lowered herself into a chair beside him, still holding Walter's blanket. Rainwater darkened the hem of her robe, and a strand of silver hair clung to her cheek. "I should have opened that garage," she said. Caleb watched Atlas through the glass. "You were grieving. So was she." Evelyn looked toward Nova, her expression folding inward. Caleb understood the weight behind those words. Guilt often arrived after the danger had passed, when the mind began inventing all the moments that might have changed everything. He had lived inside that habit for years. "Walter left the message because he knew you would need help," Caleb said. Atlas heard it. That is what mattered tonight. Dr. Cole emerged after nearly an hour. Nova was severely dehydrated and weak, but her heart was steady. The puppies were cold and hungry, yet all three responded to warmth and food. "They have a real chance," she said. Evelyn closed her eyes and released a breath that sounded like a prayer. Atlas stood before the doctor finished speaking. Through the glass, Nova lifted her head. Her gaze found him immediately. The door opened, and Atlas entered slowly, waiting for permission with every step. He approached the table and rested his chin near Nova's front paw. Her toes shifted until they touched the fur along his muzzle. Caleb sat on the floor beside them. He had spent years believing he needed to remain standing, even when standing was only another way of hiding. That night, with rain tapping softly against the clinic windows, he let his back rest against the wall. Atlas leaned against one shoulder. Evelyn sat on the other side, holding a sleeping puppy close to her chest. Caleb closed his eyes. For once, he did not hear Owen's unanswered warning. He heard Nova breathing. He heard the puppies stirring beneath the blanket. He heard Atlas sigh as the tension finally left his body. Somewhere between those small sounds, the locked room inside Caleb opened just enough to let the silence out. 3 weeks later, the garage no longer felt like a sealed room. Caleb had replaced the bent door track, repaired the roof, and painted the walls a soft gray that caught the morning light. Evelyn added clean blankets, stainless steel bowls, and a wooden shelf for medicine and food. What had once held silence now carried small sounds of life. Nova rested on a wide bed near the window, stronger each day, while her 3 puppies explored every corner with the serious determination of new recruits. Atlas watched them from the doorway, patient and alert, stepping in only when one wandered too close to a tool cabinet or tried to climb into an empty box. Caleb still opened Row Auto Repair at 7 each morning, but he no longer returned to an empty routine at the end of the day. He stopped by Evelyn's garage with supplies, repaired whatever needed fixing, and stayed long enough to hear her laugh when the smallest puppy stole one of his work gloves. The neighbors began bringing old towels and unopened bags of food. A local veterinarian offered weekly checkups. Someone donated a portable heater. No one called it a rescue center. It was simply Walter's garage, and everyone understood what that meant. Nova recovered slowly but completely. Her coat regained its dark shine, and the caution in her eyes softened whenever Atlas entered the room. The puppies grew rounder, louder, and curious about everything. One found a home with a retired schoolteacher. Another went to a young family with a fenced yard and 2 children who had waited months for the right dog. The third remained with Evelyn, who named him Walter and pretended not to notice when he slept on the chair beside her. Caleb kept the faded photograph in a frame above his workbench. Owen, Atlas, Nova, and Walter remained together there, held in one quiet moment before life had carried them in different directions. For the first time, the picture did not make Caleb look away. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the rooftops, Caleb finished tightening the final hinge on the garage door. Evelyn sat nearby with young Walter asleep at her feet. Nova rested in a patch of gold light. Caleb glanced down and realized Atlas was not beside him. The German shepherd lay near Nova and the puppy's empty bed, his head raised as he studied the room. He looked from Nova to Evelyn, then toward Caleb, as if counting everyone before the day ended. "Come on, partner," Caleb said softly. Atlas stood, crossed the concrete floor, and stopped once to touch noses with Nova. Then he walked to Caleb's side. As they stepped outside, 3 light taps sounded behind them. Caleb turned quickly. Young Walter was pawing at an empty food bowl, his tail moving against the floor. Evelyn smiled. This time, the sound was not a warning. It was not a plea from behind a locked door. It was only proof that something small was alive, safe, and waiting to be heard. Caleb rested his hand on Atlas's back as they walked home beneath the first evening stars. Some promises are spoken once. Others travel through years and footsteps, memory, and quiet loyalty until they finally reach the person willing to listen.